Voltaire was not merely a writer of the Enlightenment. He was an intellectual weapon forged against legalized ignorance. He did not decorate truth. He stripped illusion. In an age suffocated by clerical authority, absolute monarchy, and collective prejudice, he chose the only force that could not be chained, reason sharpened into satire. Before revolutions declared liberty, before modern democracies claimed freedom of thought, he had already confronted the central terror of civilization. Can a human being think without fear? Can the mind stand upright when power demands obedience? Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Voltaire did not construct monumental systems like Kant. He did not descend into the trembling inward abyss like Kierkegaard. Instead, he attacked the architecture of power itself. His philosophy was not a cathedral. It was a blade. He revealed that superstition survives not because it is true, but because it is protected. He exposed that authority fears questions more than rebellion. And now, in 2025, when algorithms amplify outrage and moral certainty disguises new fanaticisms, his question burns again. Do we truly think freely, or have we only replaced one altar with another? From that dangerous question unfolds an entire philosophical posture. Not comfort, not utopia, but the demand to confront power, suffering, faith, and freedom without illusion. Let us enter that confrontation. Voltaire was not merely a writer of the Enlightenment. He was a weapon forged against legalized ignorance. He did not decorate thought. He armed it. He did not comfort his century. He confronted it. The question that burns at the center of his philosophy is brutal in its simplicity. Can a human being think freely without fear? Before modern liberal democracies took shape, before secularism became a constitutional principle, he had already identified the alliance between dogma and power. He lived under monarchy. He breathed under clerical authority. He watched institutions sanctify obedience and punish doubt. And instead of building a closed philosophical cathedral like Kant, instead of diving into existential inwardness like Kierkegaard, he chose something more dangerous. He chose clarity. He chose ridicule. He chose reason sharpened into a blade. Criticism for him was not intellectual sport. It was a moral duty. Doubt was not weakness. It was architecture. He understood that every system claiming absolute truth hides a hunger for control. Skepticism, therefore, becomes an ethical method. To question is to refuse enslavement. Many mistake doubt for cynicism. He did not. His doubt aimed at liberation, not paralysis. He did not tear down belief to leave a void. He stripped illusions so that human dignity could breathe. In this sense, Satire became resistance. Laughter became rebellion. When he mocked fanaticism, he was not entertaining. He was dismantling fear. And fear, he knew, is the true foundation of tyranny. Religion stood at the center of his confrontation, yet he did not declare war on God. He declared war on those who claimed to own God. Long before secular modernity matured, he articulated a vision of deism, a belief in a rational creator who does not intervene through superstition or ecclesiastical manipulation. He affirmed the possibility of divine order, but rejected divine micromanagement. This distinction is decisive. He opposed the church's political authority more than faith itself. Religion, in his view, should elevate morality, not consolidate power. When faith becomes an instrument of coercion, it ceases to be sacred. It becomes machinery. Fanaticism, he insisted, is not intense belief. It is belief weaponized against difference. To persecute in the name of heaven is to betray heaven. He saw clearly that when institutions declare themselves infallible, they exempt themselves from moral accountability. And once accountability dissolves, violence follows. Tolerance, therefore, is not softness. It is civilizational strength. A society that allows dissent proves its confidence in truth. A society that silences dissent reveals insecurity. He defended freedom of thought, not because he believed humans are always right, but because without freedom, they are never fully human. Power complicated his political vision. He championed individual liberty, yet he did not romanticize the masses. He distrusted collective irrationality as much as he distrusted absolute monarchs. Here lies one of his paradoxes. He believed in enlightened rulers who could reform from above. He doubted that crowds, uneducated and inflamed, would preserve freedom responsibly. This tension exposes the limits of Enlightenment optimism. Freedom, he argued, requires intelligence. Liberty without reason collapses into chaos. Yet reason without liberty calcifies into despotism. The balance is fragile. He knew it. He wrestled with it. Evil forced him into deeper confrontation. Against naive metaphysical optimism, he refused to baptize catastrophe as part of a divine plan. When disaster strikes, when suffering shatters lives, to call it necessary is moral evasion. Pain is not sacred. It is real. And reality demands action, not theological gymnastics. He rejected the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. Such optimism anesthetizes responsibility. If everything is already optimal, why resist injustice? He stripped away this comfort. Human suffering must be reduced, not rationalized. Ethics must be practiced, not metaphysically justified. History, in his eyes, was not a parade of kings. It was the slow emergence of reason from darkness. Civilization does not advance through conquest, but through the expansion of tolerance and knowledge. Progress cannot be measured by territory or empire. It must be measured by freedom and dignity. He criticized historical narratives that glorified power while ignoring humanity. To celebrate domination is to misunderstand progress. True advancement occurs when minds are emancipated, when speech is protected, when cruelty is restrained. His influence rippled beyond his lifetime. The seeds of revolution germinated in soil he had helped till. Secular governance, freedom of the press, the right to criticize authority without execution. These are not accidents of history. They are consequences of intellectual defiance. Yet even here, we must confront contradiction. He was not free from prejudice. He did not fully escape the limitations of his century. He criticized tyranny, yet tolerated certain hierarchies. He believed in liberty, yet doubted popular sovereignty. The myth of a flawless hero collapses under scrutiny. But perhaps that is precisely the point. He himself would have demanded that we scrutinize him. And what of the present? We flatter ourselves that we are beyond fanaticism. We boast of technological sophistication as we approach 2025. Yet technology does not dissolve dogma, it amplifies it. Social platforms manufacture new orthodoxies. Digital mobs replicate the fervor of medieval tribunals. Freedom of expression is threatened not only by states, but by ideological tribes. Modernity has not cured intolerance. It has refined its tools. We no longer burn heretics. We erase them. We no longer imprison every dissenter. We isolate them socially. The mechanism changes. The impulse remains. Inside the individual, the struggle is harsher. We fear isolation more than falsehood. We silence our own doubts to preserve belonging. We adopt borrowed convictions to avoid confrontation. The deepest prison is internal. Voltaire understood that the battle against tyranny begins within the mind. To think independently is to risk rejection. To question inherited narratives is to risk loneliness. Are we prepared for that cost? Or do we prefer comfortable obedience disguised as morality? Existentially, his philosophy exposes a demand. Freedom is not given, it is exercised. And exercise implies effort. Many claim to value liberty, yet shrink from its burden. Because liberty means responsibility. It means standing without the shield of collective certainty. It means acknowledging that no authority can relieve us of moral judgment. This is terrifying. It is easier to obey, easier to conform, easier to let institutions think for us. But that ease is precisely what he attacked. He stripped away the illusion that comfort equals truth. Consider the figure of Candide, his symbolic instrument. Through that naive character, he revealed the absurdity of blind optimism. Candide embodies the human tendency to rationalize suffering rather than confront it. Through him, we see how easily doctrine anesthetizes conscience. The lesson is not despair, it is lucidity. Cultivate your garden, he suggests, not as withdrawal, but as concrete responsibility. Act where you stand. Reduce suffering where you can. Refuse metaphysical excuses. All these strands converge into a single force. Reason must serve humanity, not dominate it. Faith must humble itself before morality. Power must justify itself before freedom. History must be measured by dignity. The individual must dare to think. These are not separate doctrines. They are facets of one conviction. Human beings deserve intellectual sovereignty. And yet, sovereignty is never secure. Every generation must reclaim it. Every era invents new idols. Every society manufactures fresh dogmas. The temptation to surrender thought to authority reappears in subtler forms. Sometimes it wears religious robes. Sometimes it speaks in the language of progress. Sometimes it hides behind moral outrage. The mask shifts. The structure persists. He does not hand us a system. He hands us a posture. Stand upright before power. Question what demands obedience. Defend the right of others to disagree. Reject the seduction of absolute certainty. This posture is exhausting. It offers no paradise. It guarantees conflict, but it preserves dignity. The question that haunted his century still presses upon ours. Can we think without fear? Can we disagree without annihilating one another? Can we hold belief without weaponizing it? The answers are not theoretical. They unfold in private decisions, in moments when silence would be safer than speech. To follow his path is not to idolize him. It is to imitate his courage, to turn skepticism into moral vigilance, to confront suffering without mythologizing it, to measure progress not by spectacle, but by compassion, to recognize that freedom is fragile and must be defended intellectually before it can be protected politically. And as we probe deeper into this fragile architecture of freedom, we begin to sense that beneath criticism lies something even more radical, something that does not merely dismantle authority, but interrogates the very foundations of meaning and responsibility that authority claims to guard. What emerges when reason dares to interrogate heaven itself is not atheism, but a purified demand for responsibility. Voltaire did not kill God. He stripped God of political utility. He did not abolish transcendence. He confronted its corruption. And in doing so, he revealed a radical distinction that still unsettles us. Faith may endure, but authority must justify itself. Before secular constitutions formalized the separation of church and state, before modern discourse normalized religious pluralism, he had already sensed the fracture between belief and institution. The world around him treated theology as governance. Kings rule by divine sanction. Clergy legislated conscience. Dogma functioned as law. Yet he saw through this fusion. He understood that when God becomes a political instrument, both religion and humanity suffer degradation. His deism stands here as a decisive rupture. He affirmed the existence of a rational creator, but denied the spectacle of divine interference manufactured by ecclesiastical power. God, for him, was architect, not puppeteer, a principle of order, not a supervisor of rituals. This was not indifference. It was moral repositioning. By distancing the divine from institutional control, he liberated both conscience and responsibility. If God does not micromanage history, then humans cannot excuse injustice as destiny. They must act. Many misunderstand deism as cold abstraction. They imagine a distant clockmaker indifferent to suffering. But Voltaire's intent was sharper. He sought to prevent theology from justifying cruelty. When catastrophe strikes, when oppression flourishes, to declare it divine will is moral surrender. His God does not authorize persecution. His God does not demand blind obedience to clergy. This is the core. Faith must never become a shield for violence. He did not attack belief itself. He attacked superstition, weaponized by institutions. There is a difference. Superstition thrives on fear. It demands conformity. It punishes doubt. Faith, by contrast, can coexist with reason, but only if it relinquishes domination. Religion should cultivate virtue, not obedience to hierarchy. It should inspire compassion, not consolidate power. When it fails this test, it mutates into ideology. He saw clearly that collective superstition is more dangerous than private error. An individual may believe absurdities without consequence. A church allied with state power can enforce them. And enforcement is the turning point. Once belief acquires coercive force, dissent becomes crime. Thought becomes treason. Conscience becomes rebellion. Voltaire's resistance emerges precisely here. He demanded that belief remain personal, that morality remain universal, and that institutions remain accountable. This distinction carries existential weight. If God is rational order rather than tribal protector, then morality cannot depend on sectarian identity. It must be grounded in shared humanity. Voltaire's deism therefore undercuts fanaticism at its root. Fanaticism claims exclusive access to truth. Deism decentralizes that claim. It humbles theology before reason. It reminds us that no priest, no monarch, no institution can monopolize the infinite. And yet the tension persists. Does removing divine intervention render existence meaningless? Does a non-interfering God abandon humanity to absurdity? Here we must confront a deeper anxiety. Many cling to interventionist theology because it promises narrative coherence. Suffering becomes test. Disaster becomes plan. Injustice becomes hidden wisdom. To relinquish that comfort is terrifying. It means accepting contingency. It means acknowledging that the world is not choreographed for our reassurance. Voltaire forced this confrontation. He rejected the sentimental optimism that interprets every tragedy as necessary harmony. Such optimism anesthetizes moral urgency. If all is orchestrated perfectly, why resist cruelty? Why fight injustice? Deism, paradoxically, intensifies ethical demand. If God does not fix the world, humans must. If providence does not micromanage events, responsibility shifts to us. Freedom expands, so does burden. Here lies the psychological depth of his position. Humans crave certainty. They crave divine endorsement of their tribe, their nation, their dogma. A distant, rational God offers no such endorsement. He does not validate crusades. He does not sanctify inquisitions. He does not whisper political strategies. He leaves humanity exposed to its own conscience. That exposure is unbearable for those who prefer external authority to internal judgment. In our time approaching 2025, the pattern repeats in altered form. Institutional religion may have weakened in some regions, but ideological absolutism thrives. Political movements assume theological fervor. Social identities harden into sacred categories. The mechanism is familiar. Certainty replaces inquiry. Loyalty replaces thought. Heresy replaces disagreement. We have not transcended fanaticism. We have redistributed it. Voltaire's deism functions as silent resistance against all totalizing narratives. It insists that no structure can claim divine mandate for domination. It separates transcendence from coercion. It dissolves the sacred aura surrounding power. And once that aura dissolves, critique becomes possible. Authority must defend itself rationally, not mystically. But this liberation is double-edged. When divine surveillance recedes, existential solitude intensifies. Without constant intervention, humans face the abyss of choice. They cannot outsource morality. They cannot attribute evil solely to demonic forces or divine tests. They must confront their own agency. This is the hidden severity of deism. It removes excuses. Within the individual psyche, this removal generates anxiety. If God does not orchestrate my path, then my failures are not scripted. If suffering is not divinely assigned, then injustice demands response, not resignation. Deism, therefore, exposes human passivity as moral evasion. It confronts us with a stark demand. Will you act, or will you hide behind metaphysics? Voltaire did not seek to erase mystery. He sought to prevent mystery from becoming tyranny. The universe may remain vast, incomprehensible, ordered beyond full understanding. But that order cannot be invoked selectively to justify oppression. Here, his position becomes ethical rather than speculative. He cared less about metaphysical precision than about human consequences. Theology must be judged by its effects on freedom. Consider how easily religious language can sanctify violence. To declare one's cause divinely approved transforms opponents into enemies of God. Negotiation collapses. Mercy appears betrayal. Voltaire recognized this escalation. By redefining God as rational principle rather than partisan commander, he disarmed this rhetoric. A God of reason does not draft soldiers. A God of order does not require persecution. Yet critics accuse him of diluting religion into abstraction. They argue that personal devotion demands intimacy, not philosophical distance. But his aim was not to abolish devotion. It was to privatize it. Devotion without coercion, worship without domination, faith without censorship. This repositioning protects both believer and dissenter. It affirms spiritual possibility while denying institutional absolutism. The implications stretch further. If morality does not depend on fear of eternal punishment enforced by clergy, then virtue must arise from recognition of shared vulnerability. Compassion becomes rational necessity, not theological command. Tolerance becomes logical extension of human limitation. No one possesses total knowledge. Therefore, humility is mandatory, and humility destabilizes fanatic certainty. It reintroduces doubt as companion to faith. Doubt here is not corrosive disbelief. It is epistemic honesty. It acknowledges finitude. Voltaire's deism breathes within that acknowledgement. It affirms transcendence while refusing arrogance. The confrontation with Christianity in his era sharpened this tension. He opposed not the ethical teachings attributed to Christ, but the institutional rigidity that transformed message into mechanism. When religion punishes inquiry, it betrays its own moral aspirations. When it persecutes dissenters, it denies compassion. His critique therefore targets hypocrisy, not spirituality. In the interior life, this critique forces examination. Do we believe because we have reflected, or because we fear exclusion? Do we defend doctrine because it is true, or because it grants identity? Voltaire compels these questions without providing emotional shelter. He exposes the psychological comfort embedded in dogmatic systems. They relieve us of uncertainty. They assign blame externally. They simplify complexity. Deism dismantles that comfort. It leaves a universe governed by rational order, but devoid of micromanaged reassurance. It invites reverence without submission to clerical authority. It demands morality without threatening spectacle. It is austere, it is unsentimental, it is liberating. And yet, liberation is never neutral. Once institutional religion loses monopoly on truth, other forces rush to occupy the vacuum. Political ideologies, national myths, technological utopias, each promise coherence, each risks absolutism. The critique that dismantles ecclesiastical power must now turn toward new idols. This is where the blade sharpens again. If faith can become tyranny, so can secular certainty. If divine mandate can oppress, so can ideological righteousness. Voltaire's insistence on separating belief from coercion does not end with church reform. It expands into broader confrontation with any structure claiming unquestionable authority. Thus the interrogation deepens. If God does not legitimize power, what does? If morality stands independent of institutional enforcement, how is it preserved? If transcendence is rational but distant, where do we anchor ethical commitment? These questions begin to move beyond theology toward a more explicit clash with dogma itself, a clash that will no longer spare even the most entrenched religious narratives from relentless examination. And once the question of legitimacy detaches from divine mandate, the confrontation can no longer remain polite. It must turn directly toward doctrine itself. Voltaire did not merely refine religion. He exposed its capacity for cruelty. He did not whisper criticism, hurled it. And at the center of that storm stood institutional Christianity. Fanaticism is not faith intensified. It is faith corrupted by certainty. Voltaire saw this before the language of extremism existed. He witnessed trials justified by Scripture, He watched persecution sanctified by ritual. He understood that when religion loses tolerance, it becomes violence disguised as piety. The danger was not belief in Christ. The danger was the transformation of belief into coercive dogma. Before modern human rights discourse articulated freedom of conscience, he was already defending it with ferocity. In a Europe fractured by sectarian conflict, where dissent could cost one's life, he dared to ask a destabilizing question. Who gave any church the authority to punish thought? Theological disagreement became criminal because institutions equated doubt with rebellion against God. Voltaire stripped this equation of its sanctity. He revealed its political function. His critique operated on three levels. First, he attacked the claim of infallibility. Any institution that declares itself incapable of error abolishes dialogue. And where dialogue ends, oppression begins. Christianity, as embodied in powerful ecclesiastical structures, often presented doctrine as final truth, immune to revision. Voltaire confronted this rigidity. He insisted that no human interpreter of the divine escapes limitation. To claim otherwise is arrogance disguised as devotion. Second, he exposed the psychological mechanism of fear. Hell was not merely theological imagery, it was a disciplinary tool. Eternal punishment functioned as deterrent. Obedience was secured not by persuasion, but by terror. He understood that fear produces conformity, not virtue. A morality rooted in terror is fragile. Remove the threat, and obedience dissolves. Genuine ethics must arise from rational recognition of harm, not dread of flames. Third, he condemned persecution and acted in God's name. When authorities imprisoned, tortured, or executed dissenters, they framed brutality as defense of truth. Voltaire inverted the logic. If truth requires violence to survive, it is not truth, but insecurity. The more brutally an institution suppresses opposition, the more it reveals doubt within itself. Strength does not fear scrutiny. Only fragility demands silence. This confrontation was not abstract. It was personal. Cases of injustice ignited his pen. He intervened publicly when individuals were condemned by religious prejudice. In doing so, he transformed philosophy into action. Critique was not confined to salons. It entered courtrooms. It entered public opinion. He demonstrated that intellectual resistance must engage concrete suffering. Many accuse him of hostility toward Christianity itself. Yet his target was not the ethical core attributed to its founder. It was the institutional machinery that claimed monopoly over interpretation. He admired moral teachings grounded in compassion and humility. What he rejected was authoritarian structure. Christianity, when stripped of power, could inspire charity. When fused with state authority, it could authorize cruelty. This distinction matters because it reframes religion as contingent. It is not inherently oppressive. It becomes oppressive when allied with coercive power. Voltaire demanded separation not to annihilate faith, but to prevent its mutation into tyranny. Freedom of thought requires space free from sacred enforcement. The modern world congratulates itself for transcending such conflicts. Yet the pattern persists in altered guise. Ideological movements now mirror theological absolutism. They construct orthodoxies. They define heresies. They enforce conformity through social punishment. The vocabulary changes. The structure remains. We no longer accuse dissenters of blasphemy against God. We accuse them of betrayal against moral consensus. The effect is similar. Fear silences inquiry. Inside the individual, tension sharpens. We crave belonging. We fear exclusion. Religious communities offer identity. To question doctrine risks exile. Voltaire's challenge, therefore, penetrates the psyche. Are we loyal to truth or to tribe? Do we defend dogma because it withstands scrutiny or because it shields us from isolation? These questions wound. They destabilize comfort. Christian doctrine often promised certainty in a chaotic world. Clear rules, defined salvation, ordered hierarchy. Voltaire's critique threatened this stability. By introducing doubt, he introduced ambiguity, and ambiguity is psychologically exhausting. It requires continuous reflection. It denies final resting points. Yet he believed this exhaustion preferable to the violence of certainty. He also recognized that intolerance corrupts religion from within. A faith that cannot coexist with difference reveals insecurity about its own foundations. Tolerance does not weaken belief. It purifies it. If Christianity claims universal love yet persecutes dissenters, it contradicts itself. Voltaire exploited this contradiction relentlessly. He held religion accountable to its own moral claims. This accountability extends beyond theology into ethics. When moral norms are enforced through punishment rather than persuasion, they lose authenticity. Genuine virtue cannot be extracted by force. It must be chosen. Here, existential freedom intersects with religious critique. Without freedom, morality is performance. With freedom, it becomes responsibility. Approaching 2025, we witness new forms of moral absolutism clothed in secular language. Public shaming replaces excommunication. Social ostracism replaces banishment. The instinct to purify community by expelling dissent remains alive. Voltaire's voice cuts through this pattern. He reminds us that intolerance always begins by claiming righteousness. The psychological root of fanaticism lies in anxiety. Certainty calms, ambiguity unsettles. Dogma promises clarity. It divides world into saved and damned, pure and corrupt, faithful and heretic. Such binaries reduce complexity. They simplify moral decision. But simplicity achieved through exclusion breeds cruelty. Voltaire refused this reduction. He accepted complexity as price of humanity. Consider the internal conflict of a believer confronted with doubt. Doubt threatens identity. It destabilizes inherited narratives. To preserve coherence, the mind may suppress questions. Institutions often encourage this suppression, framing doubt as sin. Voltaire redefined doubt as courage. To question is not betrayal. It is intellectual integrity. His confrontation with Christianity, therefore, becomes emblematic of a broader struggle against any closed system. Closed systems demand submission. They promise security. They fear revision. Open systems risk instability. They invite challenge. They require humility. Voltaire aligned himself with openness despite its discomfort. This alignment carries ethical implications. When individuals possess freedom of conscience, diversity becomes inevitable. Uniformity cannot be enforced without violence. Tolerance emerges not as optional virtue, but as structural necessity. Christianity, when fused with power, resisted this necessity. It attempted uniformity. Voltaire insisted on plurality. Yet, plurality raises political questions. If beliefs diverge radically, how can society remain cohesive? Here, the tension between liberty and order surfaces. Too much uniformity crushes freedom. Too much fragmentation threatens stability. Voltaire sensed this dilemma. He sought equilibrium where law protects diversity without imposing doctrinal conformity. The confrontation with Christian dogma thus prepares terrain for deeper inquiry into power itself. Once religious authority is challenged, political authority cannot remain immune. If churches must justify coercion, so must monarchs. If doctrine cannot silence dissent, neither can crowns. The critique expands. But expansion intensifies risk. To undermine sacred authority destabilizes social foundations. Many feared chaos. They preferred oppressive order to uncertain freedom. Voltaire rejected this false choice. Order without liberty is imprisonment. Liberty without order is instability. The task is synthesis, not surrender. Inside each individual, the same tension unfolds. We oscillate between desire for guidance and desire for autonomy. Christianity offered structured guidance. Voltaire's critique invited autonomy. Autonomy demands maturity. It requires self-governance. Without it, freedom decays into impulse. Thus, his attack on dogma is not nihilistic. It is preparatory. It clears space for responsible freedom. It forces institutions to relinquish sacred immunity. It demands that authority, whether religious or secular, justify itself through reason and respect for human dignity. As the critique deepens, attention inevitably shifts toward the architecture of power beyond theology. Once heaven is disentangled from coercion, the earthly structures that claim to protect order must face the same relentless interrogation. And once heaven has been stripped of its political armor, the crown can no longer hide behind sacred light. Power must stand alone, naked, accountable. Voltaire understood that dismantling religious absolutism was only the beginning. The deeper question remained: who governs and by what right? Freedom is not the absence of authority. It is the condition under which authority must justify itself. Voltaire did not romanticize chaos. He did not worship rebellion for its own sake. He knew that societies collapse without structure. Yet he also knew that structure without liberty suffocates the human spirit. Between anarchy and tyranny lies a narrow path, and he walked it with tension in every step. Before democratic revolutions reshaped political imagination, before constitutions declared rights as inherent rather than granted, he confronted the paradox of monarchy. He criticized despotism, yet he did not fully trust the crowd. He championed individual liberty, yet he doubted the wisdom of uneducated masses. This contradiction is not weakness. It is the fracture line of Enlightenment thought. He believed in enlightened rulers, not because he adored hierarchy, but because he feared irrationality. A king guided by reason, he thought, could implement reforms that mobs could not conceive. Reform from above appeared more stable than upheaval from below. But here the tension sharpens. Can freedom be gifted, or must it be seized? If liberty depends on benevolent power, is it truly liberty? Voltaire wrestled with this without resolving it cleanly. He saw that the masses, inflamed by superstition or resentment, could become instruments of destruction. History had shown revolts devolving into bloodshed. He feared that unrestrained democracy might replace one tyranny with another. His skepticism toward the crowd stemmed from psychological realism. Humans are not automatically rational when aggregated. Emotion amplifies. Fear spreads. Violence escalates. Yet he never surrendered the principle of personal freedom. Speech must be protected. Conscience must be free. Property must be secure. These were not negotiable. Power exists to safeguard these conditions, not to override them. A ruler, enlightened or not, loses legitimacy the moment he silences thought. Authority cannot demand intellectual submission without betraying its own function. The paradox intensifies here. Voltaire's acceptance of enlightened monarchy reveals a strategic compromise. He sought gradual reform rather than radical rupture. Stability mattered. Progress, for him, required order. But order must evolve. It cannot fossilize. An enlightened despot who refuses reform becomes simply a despot. This tension mirrors the human psyche. Within each individual, there exists a desire for guidance and a hunger for autonomy. We want protection. We also want freedom. Too much control suffocates. Too much freedom terrifies. The political structure becomes projection of this internal struggle. Voltaire perceived that governance must navigate between these poles. In approaching 2025, the paradox persists in altered form. Democracies claim popular sovereignty, yet centralized power expands. Citizens demand liberty, yet tolerate surveillance in exchange for security. We oscillate between fear of authority and fear of instability. Voltaire's dilemma remains ours. Can freedom survive without wisdom? Can order endure without restraint? He argued that liberty requires intelligence. Freedom without critical thought degenerates into impulsive reaction. When citizens lack education, manipulation thrives. Demagogues exploit emotion. Crowds become volatile. Thus, he insisted on cultivation of reason. Political liberty divorced from intellectual maturity collapses into spectacle. Freedom demands discipline of mind. Yet, discipline cannot be imposed by coercion without contradiction. Here lies the delicate equilibrium. Education must enlighten, not indoctrinate. Law must protect, not dominate. Power must limit itself. Voltaire's political vision is not utopian. It is pragmatic. He understood human frailty. He accounted for selfishness, ambition, fear. He did not assume virtue as default condition. His critique of absolute monarchy remains direct. No ruler is infallible. No throne is sacred. The legitimacy of power derives from its service to human dignity. When a king governs for personal glory rather than public good, he forfeits moral authority. The same applies to any governing body. Titles do not sanctify injustice. But Voltaire's hesitation toward full democracy exposes anxiety about collective irrationality. He saw how quickly public opinion can turn violent. The same masses that cheer reform can demand blood. Liberty without institutional safeguards is fragile. Thus, he favored reform guided by enlightened leadership rather than revolutionary upheaval. This position invites criticism. Does it underestimate the capacity of ordinary people? Does it privilege elite intellect over popular voice? Yes, it reveals elitism. Voltaire did not entirely escape the hierarchy of his age. Yet even in his skepticism, he insisted that individuals possess inherent rights. His doubt concerned collective behavior, not human worth. The existential dimension surfaces here. Freedom is not simply political arrangement. It is inner stance. One may live under monarchy and still think independently. One may live in democracy and remain mentally enslaved. Voltaire's emphasis on reason underscores this. Political reform without intellectual courage achieves little. External liberty cannot compensate for internal cowardice. He confronted power not only as structure, but as temptation. Authority seduces. It offers control. It promises stability. Those who hold it rationalize dominance as necessary. Those who lack it may crave it. The will to power is not confined to kings. It pulses within every human ego. Thus, political philosophy becomes moral psychology. Consider how easily individuals justify small tyrannies in daily life. Control within family, domination in workplace, suppression of dissent in conversation. These microcosms mirror macro power. Voltaire's critique of despotism extends into these intimate arenas. If we condemn absolute monarchs, yet practice domination personally, we perpetuate the same logic. His insistence that power must answer to reason applies universally. Authority must articulate justification. It cannot rely solely on tradition or force. This principle destabilizes inherited hierarchies. It invites scrutiny. It demands transparency. Power resists this demand instinctively. Exposure threatens control. In contemporary societies nearing 2025, power rarely presents itself as tyranny. It appears administrative, managerial, protective. Yet the mechanism of control persists. Laws expand. Surveillance intensifies. Speech is moderated, often in the name of safety or harmony. Voltaire would ask the uncomfortable question, who defines safety? Who decides which speech threatens order? When does protection become pretext? The fragile relationship between liberty and security remains unresolved. Too much liberty may risk instability. Too much security may suffocate dissent. The equilibrium requires constant vigilance. Freedom cannot be assumed permanent. It erodes quietly when citizens trade it for comfort. Voltaire's political paradox therefore becomes warning. Enlightened rulers may reform, but they may also entrench. Crowds may demand justice, but they may also descend into vengeance. Neither monarchy nor democracy guarantees virtue. Only sustained critical reason restrains excess. Inside the individual, the challenge sharpens. Do we seek leaders who think for us, or do we accept the burden of judgment? Delegating moral responsibility to authority feels efficient. It relieves anxiety, yet it infantilizes. Voltaire's demand for intellectual autonomy confronts this temptation. He refuses to absolve us of responsibility. His political thought converges on one core assertion: freedom survives only where power limits itself. This limitation cannot rely solely on goodwill. It requires institutional design, cultural habit, and moral courage. Laws must restrain rulers. Citizens must resist manipulation. Education must cultivate skepticism. The tension between liberty and authority is permanent. It cannot be resolved once and for all. Each generation renegotiates it. Each society recalibrates it. Voltaire's contribution lies not in final solution, but in relentless questioning. He destabilizes complacency. As the critique of monarchy deepens, another principle emerges from the shadows. If power must be restrained and liberty preserved, then the glue that holds society together cannot be fear. It must be something stronger, something capable of sustaining difference without collapsing into violence. And that force begins to take shape in a word he wielded with fierce conviction. Tolerance is not kindness. It is strength under restraint. It is the refusal to destroy what unsettles you. Voltaire understood that without tolerance, freedom collapses into perpetual conflict. Power may be restrained by law, but society fractures without the moral capacity to endure difference. And difference is inevitable wherever thought is free. He did not romanticize harmony. He did not assume that humans naturally accept one another. On the contrary, he saw how easily suspicion turns into hostility. Religious wars had torn Europe apart. Doctrinal disputes had justified bloodshed. The lesson was brutal and clear. When belief becomes identity, and identity becomes weapon, coexistence disintegrates. Before pluralism became an official doctrine of modern states, defended it as existential necessity. If individuals possess freedom of conscience, then disagreement is unavoidable. The attempt to eliminate disagreement leads to persecution. Therefore, tolerance is not optional virtue. It is structural requirement for civilized life. Tolerance does not mean indifference to truth. It means recognition of human limitation. No individual, no institution grasps totality. Certainty must be tempered by humility. Voltaire demanded this humility from religious authorities, from monarchs, from citizens. The inability to tolerate dissent reveals insecurity masked as conviction. He framed tolerance as moral courage. It is easy to love those who mirror you. It is difficult to respect those who contradict you. Yet civilization is measured precisely at that difficulty. A society that protects only agreeable speech is not free. It is fragile. Freedom of expression becomes meaningful only when it safeguards what irritates, what provokes, what destabilizes. Comfort. Many misinterpret tolerance as weakness. They equate it with surrender. Voltaire inverted this logic. To tolerate is to possess confidence in reason. If your belief withstands scrutiny, you need not silence opposition. If your morality is grounded in humanity, you need not fear diversity. Suppression signals doubts. The psychological dimension cuts deeper. Intolerance often arises from fear of contamination. The other threatens identity. Difference challenges certainty. By eliminating the other, one imagines preserving coherence. But this preservation is illusion. Identity fortified by exclusion becomes brittle. It cannot adapt. It shatters under pressure. Voltaire's insistence on tolerance exposes the internal fragility of fanatic minds. The fanatic demands uniformity because ambiguity terrifies him. Tolerance requires tolerance of uncertainty. It accepts that coexistence does not resolve disagreement. It manages it. It creates space where conflict does not escalate into violence. Approaching 2025, the paradox intensifies. Digital networks amplify voices. Diversity becomes visible at unprecedented scale. Yet, instead of expanding tolerance, many retreat into ideological enclaves. Algorithms reinforce echo chambers. Difference becomes caricature. Outrage becomes currency. We declare ourselves defenders of freedom while demanding censorship of opposing views. Voltaire would recognize this pattern instantly. The instruments have changed. The impulse remains. Social condemnation replaces public execution. Reputation destruction replaces imprisonment. The mechanism of silencing evolves, but the desire to eliminate dissent persists. True tolerance is not passive. It demands active defense of the rights of those with whom we disagree. This is the severe test. Are we willing to protect speech that challenges our convictions, or do we defend freedom only when convenient? Voltaire's position is uncompromising. Liberty that excludes adversaries is counterfeit. This principle stabilizes society more effectively than fear. Fear enforces silence temporarily. It breeds resentment. It erupts eventually. Tolerance channels conflict into dialogue rather than violence. It accepts tension as permanent condition. It recognizes that unity achieved through coercion is illusion. The existential core lies here. Each individual must confront the discomfort of pluralism. To live among others who reject your deepest beliefs is unsettling. It forces introspection. It demands articulation. It prevents complacency. Tolerance, therefore, sharpens thought. It does not dull it. Voltaire saw tolerance as foundation of civil society. Law must protect diversity of belief. Institutions must remain neutral among competing doctrines. The state cannot privilege one conscience over another without undermining equality. Once privilege enters, hierarchy follows, and hierarchy fuels resentment. Yet tolerance has limits. It cannot extend to violence. Tolerate aggression is to betray victims. Voltaire's conception distinguishes between opinion and harm. Speech may offend. Violence destroys. The line is moral, not emotional. We must endure offense to preserve liberty. We must prevent harm to preserve humanity. The psychological struggle emerges again. Humans conflate offense with injury. Words wound pride. We interpret disagreement as attack. Intolerance often disguises wounded ego. Voltaire's demand for tolerance requires resilience. Not every insult justifies suppression. Not every challenge constitutes threat. In modern discourse approaching 2025, the vocabulary of safety expands. Emotional discomfort is framed as danger. Spaces are curated to avoid confrontation. While protection from genuine harm is essential, insulation from disagreement weakens intellectual muscle. Voltaire would argue that exposure to contesting views fortifies reason. Tolerance also redefines patriotism. A nation confident in itself permits dissent. It does not equate criticism with betrayal. When loyalty demands silence, authoritarian impulse resurfaces. Voltaire's legacy insists that love of country must coexist with critique. Otherwise, patriotism degenerates into idolatry. The moral architecture of tolerance rests on equality of dignity. Every person, regardless of belief, possesses inherent worth. This worth precedes agreement. It does not fluctuate with ideology. When societies internalize this principle, stability strengthens. When they abandon it, fragmentation accelerates. Inside the individual, tolerance demands self-control. Anger surges when confronted with opposition. The instinct to retaliate emerges quickly. To restrain that impulse is discipline. It is recognition that immediate domination undermines long-term coexistence. Voltaire's call is not sentimental harmony. It is disciplined restraint grounded in rational foresight. He understood that intolerance escalates recursively. One faction suppresses another. The suppressed retaliate when empowered. Cycles of revenge form. Only tolerance interrupts this spiral. It creates precedent for peaceful disagreement. It transforms enemies into interlocutors. Yet tolerance alone does not guarantee justice. Structural inequalities persist. Prejudices linger. The task is continuous. It requires vigilance. It demands cultural reinforcement. Without education in critical thinking and empathy, tolerance erodes under pressure. As societies evolve toward 2025, pluralism intensifies through migration, globalization, digital communication. The temptation to retreat into homogeneity strengthens simultaneously. Voltaire's insight becomes more urgent. Civilization survives not by eliminating difference, but by regulating it through respect. The internal question becomes unavoidable. Do we value being right more than living together? Do we prefer purity over peace? These are not abstract dilemmas. They shape laws, institutions, communities. Tolerance requires sacrifice of ego. It requires acceptance that others will persist in error as we perceive it. That persistence must not provoke annihilation. Voltaire's philosophy converges again on responsibility. Tolerance is not granted by rulers alone. It must be practiced by citizens. Laws can prohibit persecution. They cannot enforce respect. Cultural maturity must cultivate it. And yet beneath tolerance lies an even harsher challenge. What happens when suffering enters the equation? When catastrophe strikes? When innocent lives shatter? Tolerance seems insufficient. In the face of overwhelming pain, philosophical restraint trembles. It is there, in confrontation with evil itself, that reason must prove whether it can endure without surrendering either to blind optimism or to despair. And when suffering erupts without warning, Tolerance alone feels fragile. It trembles before the weight of catastrophe. It hesitates before the cry of the innocent. In that moment, philosophy faces its most brutal interrogation. Not the problem of disagreement, not the problem of power, but the problem of evil. Evil is not an abstraction. It is shattered bodies. It is collapsed cities. It is injustice that crushes without apology. Voltaire understood this with ferocity. He did not debate evil from a distance. He confronted it through historical trauma, through disaster that mocked metaphysical optimism. And he refused the comfort of explanation that disguises cruelty as necessity. Before modern existentialism named the absurd, he had already sensed it. The claim that we live in the best of all possible worlds struck him as moral obscenity. To declare catastrophe part of a perfect plan is to insult the victims. Optimism, when detached from reality, becomes cruelty in disguise. It anesthetizes conscience. He dismantled the doctrine that suffering must serve divine harmony. If disaster destroys thousands, it is not redeemed by speculative metaphysics. Pain remains pain. Death remains loss. No theological narrative can erase the scream of the crushed. He stripped away the illusion that reason can justify every horror. This rejection was not nihilism. It was ethical revolt. To refuse false consolation is to preserve moral seriousness. If suffering is rationalized as necessary, resistance weakens. If evil is explained as inevitable good, injustice loses urgency. Voltaire refused this surrender. He insisted that evil demands response, not rationalization. He attacked naive optimism on three fronts. First, he exposed its detachment from lived reality. Philosophers who proclaimed cosmic harmony often did so from safe distance. Theories flourished in salons, while bodies were buried in ruins. Voltaire insisted that philosophy must account for experience, not override it. Second, he revealed the psychological comfort embedded in optimistic doctrine. To believe that everything happens for a reason shields us from despair. It transforms chaos into narrative. But this comfort comes at cost. It dulls outrage. It weakens action. If suffering is divinely orchestrated, intervention becomes interference. Third, he reoriented morality away from speculation toward practice. Instead of debating why evil exists, he urged reduction of suffering where possible. Ethics becomes practical labor, not metaphysical puzzle. Cultivate your garden. Act locally. Relieve pain concretely. This shift grounds responsibility. The existential depth of this move cannot be overstated. When divine plans are withdrawn as explanation, humans confront contingency. The world is not arranged for our reassurance. Earthquakes do not discriminate. Disease does not negotiate. Injustice erupts from human cruelty. The universe offers no guarantee of fairness. This recognition threatens despair. Without providential assurance, meaning appears fragile. Yet, Voltaire did not collapse into hopelessness. He redefined meaning as action rather than explanation. You may not comprehend the cosmos, but you can alleviate suffering. You cannot eliminate evil entirely, but you can resist it. In approaching 2025, the temptation toward renewed optimism resurfaces in technological form. We believe progress will eliminate tragedy. We imagine innovation will conquer suffering. Yet, pandemics spread, wars erupt, inequality deepens. Technology amplifies both healing and harm. The myth of inevitable progress mirrors earlier theological optimism. It reassures, it deceives. Voltaire's critique penetrates here as well. Progress is not automatic. It requires moral vigilance. Without ethical grounding, advancement intensifies destruction. Tools magnify intention. If intention is corrupt, outcome follows. The belief that history inevitably improves blinds us to regression. Psychologically, humans resist confronting randomness. We crave causality. We assign blame to fate, to destiny, to divine will. This assignment protects us from the terror of unpredictability. Voltaire stripped this defense. The world contains chaos. Accept it, but do not sanctify it. His confrontation with evil also destabilizes simplistic blame. Not all suffering originates in human malice. Natural disaster exposes vulnerability without moral intent. Yet human response reveals character. Indifference compounds tragedy. Solidarity mitigates it. The moral question shifts from why did this happen to what will we do now? This shift intensifies freedom. Without metaphysical justification, responsibility expands. You cannot excuse cruelty as divine instrument. You cannot dismiss injustice as necessary stage of cosmic plan. Action becomes imperative. Inside the individual psyche, the problem of evil manifests as internal fracture. We witness suffering and feel impotence. We confront injustice and feel rage. We oscillate between despair and denial. Optimism offers escape. Cynicism offers numbness. Voltaire rejected both extremes. He chose lucid engagement. Lucidity is harsh. It accepts limits. It acknowledges that some questions lack answers. It resists fabrication of comfort. Yet it preserves integrity. Better honest uncertainty than consoling falsehood. Better incomplete understanding than moral anesthetic. This lucidity undercuts fanaticism. Fanatics often interpret catastrophe as divine judgment against enemies. They weaponize disaster to reinforce ideology. Voltaire's refusal to attribute suffering to providential punishment dissolves this cruelty. Disaster is not proof of moral hierarchy. It is shared vulnerability. The existential demand deepens further. If suffering is not divinely assigned, then injustice perpetrated by humans is not sacred mandate. It is choice. And choice implies accountability. Tyrants cannot hide behind providence. Oppressors cannot claim cosmic necessity. Evil becomes human responsibility. Yet, this responsibility weighs heavily. Without guarantee of ultimate justice, resistance may seem futile. Voltaire confronted this despair indirectly. He did not promise cosmic balance. He offered practical resistance. Act within your sphere. Reduce harm. Defend the innocent. Do not wait for metaphysical clarity. This ethic resonates intensely in contemporary crises approaching 2025. Climate disasters intensify. Conflicts displace populations. Inequality fractures societies. Grand narratives attempt to explain away suffering as transitional phase of progress. Voltaire's voice interrupts. Explanation without alleviation is moral evasion. He refused to romanticize suffering. Pain does not ennoble automatically. It wounds, it scars, it destroys. The glorification of suffering perpetuates passivity. To sanctify pain is to betray victims. The proper response is mitigation, not metaphysical poetry. The internal challenge persists. How do we sustain hope without illusion? How do we act without certainty of success? Voltaire's answer remains implicit. Hope grounded in action, not in guaranteed outcome. Meaning grounded in solidarity, not in cosmic design. This reorientation reframes tolerance itself. It is easier to tolerate abstract difference than to tolerate the chaos of suffering. Yet shared vulnerability can deepen compassion. When we recognize that catastrophe does not discriminate, solidarity becomes rational necessity. The confrontation with evil also prepares a broader historical reflection. If suffering punctuates history, can we still speak of progress? If cruelty recurs, what does advancement mean? Voltaire wrestled with this tension between darkness and enlightenment. He saw glimmers of improvement in expansion of reason and reduction of persecution, yet he never denied regression. Thus the inquiry shifts again, from evil as immediate catastrophe to history as long narrative of struggle between ignorance and lucidity, between cruelty and reform, between domination and dignity. The question emerges with renewed force. Does humanity learn or merely repeat? Does humanity truly advance, or does it merely refine its methods of domination? Voltaire refused to answer this with blind faith. He did not worship history. He interrogated it. He stripped it of myth and forced it to stand as evidence. History is not a sacred chronicle of kings. It is the slow and uneven emancipation of reason from darkness. That was his wager. Before progress became slogan, before revolutions institutionalized the language of rights, he had already reframed civilization. It is not measured by conquest. It is measured by consciousness. He saw that traditional historiography glorified power, battles, dynasties, territorial expansion. These dominated the narrative. But what does it mean for humanity if borders shift while minds remain shackled? What does victory signify if persecution persists? Voltaire redirected attention. The true milestones of civilization are not military triumphs, but reductions of cruelty, not coronations, but liberation of thought. He positioned this view against both naive optimism and cynical despair. On one side, those who believed history inevitably unfolds toward perfection. On the other, those who saw only repetition of violence. Voltaire stood between them. He acknowledged regression. He recognized brutality. Yet he insisted that reason can expand its domain. Before modern sociology, Before systematic anthropology, he compared cultures. He refused to see Europe as sole center of civilization. This comparative lens destabilized arrogance. Progress is not monopoly of one tradition. It emerges wherever inquiry displaces superstition, wherever tolerance replaces fanaticism. He redefined advancement through three criteria. First, expansion of intellectual freedom. When speech becomes safer, civilization strengthens. When censorship intensifies, decline begins. Second, refinement of moral sensitivity. As societies grow less tolerant of torture, persecution, arbitrary punishment, they ascend. Third, institutional limitation of power. When rulers become accountable, history bends toward dignity. This framework dismantles triumphalism. Empires may dominate continents while failing all three measures. A technologically advanced society may still persecute dissent. Progress is conditional. It can reverse. Approaching 2025, the illusion of automatic advancement tempts us again. Scientific breakthroughs dazzle. Communication accelerates. Yet, polarization deepens. Authoritarian tendencies resurface. Surveillance expands. If technology increases, but tolerance decreases, can we claim progress? Voltaire would answer without hesitation, no. He understood that history does not move by divine script. It moves through human decision. Enlightenment is not destiny. It is labor. Every generation must defend gains achieved by predecessors. Freedom, once secured, can erode. Civilization, once advanced, can regress. The psychological root of historical optimism lies in desire for reassurance. We want to believe suffering diminishes inevitably. We want to imagine cruelty belongs to the past. But Voltaire's realism interrupts this comfort. Darkness recurs whenever vigilance wanes. Yet he rejected fatalism. If history were merely cyclical violence, resistance would be futile. His own activism proves he believed change possible. He saw improvements in legal reform, in growing critique of torture, in widening intellectual exchange. These were not miracles. They were results of persistent questioning. He challenged historians who glorified monarchs while ignoring common people. To narrate only the deeds of rulers distorts reality. Civilization grows not only through decrees, but through shifts in thought, through subtle transformations in moral expectation. When ordinary citizens demand fairness, history shifts. Voltaire's vision therefore democratizes significance while remaining skeptical of mob irrationality. Progress depends on informed public, not manipulated crowd. Education becomes engine of advancement. Without it, freedom decays. Inside the individual, the historical question mirrors existential doubt. Does my life move toward meaning, or do I repeat patterns of error? Just as societies oscillate between enlightenment and regression, individuals oscillate between lucidity and self-deception. History becomes macro-reflection of inner struggle. He also recognized the danger of mythologizing the past. Nostalgia often romanticizes eras marked by oppression. By exposing historical brutality, he prevented idealization. Clear memory protects against repetition. Sanitized history invites relapse. Civilization, in his account, emerges gradually from cruelty toward empathy. But empathy requires imagination. Exposure to diverse perspectives expands moral horizon. Isolation contracts it. Thus, openness to exchange fosters progress. Xenophobia arrests it. In approaching 2025, globalization connects cultures intensely. Yet reactionary movements resist this connection. They frame diversity as threat. Voltaire's comparative outlook challenges this fear. Encounter with difference, though destabilizing, refines understanding. He also redefined heroism. True heroes are not conquerors, but reformers. Those who reduce suffering deserve admiration. Those who expand freedom deserve remembrance. This reorientation transforms values. Glory detached from humanity becomes hollow. However, Voltaire did not deny that history contains irreversible loss. Civilizations collapse, libraries burn, knowledge disappears, progress is fragile. Awareness of fragility intensifies urgency. Preservation of enlightenment requires institutional memory and active defense. The tension between conditional hope and sober realism defines his historical philosophy. He neither canonized progress nor surrendered to despair. He held history accountable to human dignity. This accountability demands constant measurement. Are we becoming more just, more tolerant, more rational? If not, advancement is illusion. The existential weight of this perspective falls on present action. Future generations will judge our era as we judge predecessors. Will they see expansion of liberty or contraction, reduction of cruelty or normalization of it? History is not museum, it is courtroom. Voltaire's thought also challenges deterministic narratives that reduce human behavior to economic or divine forces. Structures influence, they do not absolve. Choice persists. Individuals shape epochs. Responsibility cannot dissolve into abstraction. He understood that writing history itself is moral act. Selection of events reveals values. To center suffering rather than conquest reframes meaning. To highlight reform rather than domination shifts aspiration. Narrative influences identity. Inside each person, similar narrative construction occurs. We interpret our past to justify present. We highlight successes, minimize failures. Voltaire's insistence on clarity demands honesty in both personal and collective memory. As societies advance toward 2025, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and digital networks promise transformation. But technology does not guarantee moral evolution. Without ethical cultivation, tools intensify capacity for harm. Progress in knowledge must align with progress in conscience. Thus, his conditional optimism remains relevant. History can bend toward greater dignity, but only if individuals resist fanaticism, restrain power, cultivate tolerance, confront evil without illusion. The chain linking chapters of civilization depends on fragile human decisions. The deeper question lingers. If progress is possible yet reversible, what sustains it across generations? Ideas travel, influence spreads. Some voices echo beyond their time. Voltaire's own legacy becomes example of how thought can outlive mortality, shaping movements he never witnessed directly. And it is in tracing that enduring influence that the narrative of enlightenment acquires another dimension. Ideas outlive the bodies that carry them. They travel through time like quiet detonations, reshaping landscapes long after the hand that lit the fuse has turned to dust. Voltaire understood this without ever witnessing the full magnitude of his impact. He wrote for his century. He armed the next. Influence is not noise. It is transformation. And his thought did not remain confined to salons or pamphlets. It seeped into political consciousness. It eroded sacred certainties. It prepared minds for rupture. Before revolutions erupted, he had already dismantled the intellectual scaffolding that sustained unquestioned authority. He did not storm prisons. He stormed assumptions. And assumptions, once cracked, cannot easily be restored. His relentless critique of clerical power, his defense of civil liberties, his insistence on tolerance, these ideas accumulated pressure beneath the surface of European society. When the French Revolution ignited, it did not emerge from vacuum. It emerged from decades of intellectual corrosion directed at absolutism. Yet his influence is not reducible to revolutionary slogans. He was not architect of chaos. He was architect of critique. The revolutionaries inherited his distrust of tyranny, his contempt for fanaticism, his demand for secular governance. But they also inherited the unresolved tension between liberty and order. Influence does not guarantee fidelity. Ideas mutate in hands of successors. The secularization of modern political thought bears his imprint. The separation of church and state, now fundamental principle in many societies, reflects his insistence that faith must not command law. The legitimacy of power must derive from rational justification, not divine endorsement. This shift reconfigured the structure of governance across continents. Freedom of the press likewise owed debt to his audacity. He did not merely argue abstractly for free expression. He practiced it. He risked exile. He challenged censorship. By embodying intellectual defiance, he demonstrated that speech is not luxury. It is weapon against oppression. Modern journalism, investigative critique, public debate all operate within space he helped carve. But influence extends beyond institutions. It shapes mentality. Voltaire cultivated the spirit of skepticism that permeated Western intellectual culture. Question authority, demand evidence, refuse blind obedience. These attitudes, now often taken for granted, required pioneers willing to confront danger. Before Enlightenment became historical period, it was personal posture. He modeled that posture. He proved that one individual, armed only with language and reason, could destabilize entrenched systems. This example emboldened others. Thinkers across Europe absorbed his tone of fearless inquiry. Yet influence is double-edged. When critique becomes fashionable, it risks superficiality. Skepticism can degenerate into cynicism. Secularism can morph into dogmatic anti-religion. Revolution can devolve into terror. Voltaire's legacy illustrates this ambiguity. His defense of reason inspired liberation. It also contributed to ideological battles he might not have endorsed. In approaching 2025, his intellectual DNA remains active. Secular democracies operate within framework shaped by Enlightenment thought. Academic culture prizes critical inquiry. Media challenges authority. Yet the same spirit encounters new adversaries. Populist movements question liberal institutions. Religious resurgence contests secular norms. The struggle continues. His influence also penetrates education. The emphasis on rational debate, evidence-based argument, comparative study of cultures reflects his approach. Knowledge is not inherited unquestioned. It is examined. Tradition is not sacred. It is scrutinized. This educational ethos strengthens autonomy, but autonomy carries risk. When every authority is suspect, stability weakens. Excessive skepticism can erode trust necessary for social cohesion. Voltaire balanced critique with ethical grounding. Reason must serve humanity. Without moral compass, skepticism becomes destructive. His impact on later thinkers cannot be overstated. Enlightenment philosophers expanded his critique into systematic frameworks. Revolutionary leaders translated his ideas into political action. Human rights discourse echoes his insistence on inherent dignity. Even contemporary debates on freedom of speech trace lineage to his audacity. Yet legacy invites mythologizing. He becomes symbol rather than complex human. To canonize him uncritically would betray his spirit. He himself demanded examination. Influence does not sanctify. It invites continuation of questioning. The psychological resonance of his legacy lies in empowerment. Individuals reading his works encountered not dogma, but invitation. Think, doubt, speak. This invitation disrupts passivity. It transforms readers into participants. Influence thus operates internally as well as institutionally. Modern secular societies often assume neutrality toward belief. This neutrality is not absence of values, it is structural tolerance. The idea that state must not enforce doctrine stems directly from his battles. In defending victims of religious injustice, he established precedent that conscience outranks institution. As societies move toward 2025, freedom of expression faces renewed threats. Misinformation spreads rapidly. Calls for regulation intensify. The tension between protecting truth and preserving liberty resurfaces. Voltaire's influence challenges simplistic solutions. Suppressing speech to protect society risks empowering censors. Yet, unchecked falsehood harms public trust. The balance remains delicate. His legacy also informs global human rights frameworks. The assertion that individuals possess rights independent of cultural or religious authority echoes his universalist impulse. He compared civilizations to reveal shared humanity. This comparative perspective undercuts ethnocentrism. Yet, he was not immune to prejudice. Some of his views reflect limitations of his era. Influence, therefore, requires critical adaptation. We inherit both strength and flaw. To engage his legacy responsibly means preserving commitment to reason while correcting inherited biases. The existential dimension persists. When individuals assert intellectual independence, they draw upon lineage of thinkers who risked isolation. Voltaire exemplifies this courage. His exile, his controversies, his relentless writing illustrate cost of dissent. Influence inspires by example, not merely by text. Historical memory often simplifies influence into causal chains. In reality, it functions as network. Ideas intersect, movements overlap. Voltaire did not act alone. He participated in broader intellectual ferment. Yet his distinctive voice amplified resonance. Influence arises from convergence of timing, clarity, and courage. In approaching 2025, digital communication accelerates spread of ideas. Influence multiplies instantly, yet depth may diminish. Voltaire's sustained argumentation contrasts with fragmentary discourse of modern platforms. His legacy challenges us to preserve rigor amid speed. The seed he planted was not doctrine, but attitude. Refuse intimidation, expose hypocrisy, defend dignity. This attitude transcends era. It adapts to context. It remains combustible. But influence also invites scrutiny of origin. Who was the man behind the myth? Where did his contradictions lie? How did his own limitations shape his thought? To examine his legacy fully, we must confront the fractures within it, because no thinker, however luminous, escapes tension between ideals and personal boundaries. And it is precisely within those tensions that the next layer of understanding emerges. No thinker escapes contradiction. To demand perfection from a philosopher of freedom is to misunderstand freedom itself. Voltaire dismantled idols, yet he could not completely dismantle the assumptions of his own century. His legacy glows, but it is not pure light. It contains fracture, and those fractures matter. He attacked despotism with relentless energy. He ridiculed absolute monarchy. He exposed clerical tyranny. Yet he accepted the possibility of enlightened despotism. He distrusted the masses. He doubted that common people left to themselves could sustain liberty rationally. Here lies the tension. How can one defend universal freedom while withholding confidence from the majority? This contradiction reveals both realism and limitation. He witnessed mobs inflamed by superstition. He saw violence erupt from ignorance. He feared chaos as much as oppression. His support for reform from above was not betrayal of liberty, but anxiety about instability. Still, the question remains sharp. Can freedom mature if it is not entrusted to those it claims to liberate? He championed tolerance. He denounced persecution. Yet at times he expressed cultural prejudices reflective of his era. He criticized religious fanaticism while occasionally caricaturing entire communities. This inconsistency does not erase his contribution, but it exposes the inescapable influence of historical context. No mind floats above its time completely. Before modern discourse on equality solidified, he operated within hierarchical assumptions common to 18th century Europe. His critique of power did not always extend fully to social stratification. He fought for civil liberties, yet did not envision complete democratic egalitarianism as later generations would. Enlightenment carried seeds of universalism, but it had not yet unfolded fully. This tension forces us to confront uncomfortable truth. Intellectual courage does not guarantee moral omniscience. One may challenge one structure of domination while overlooking another. Voltaire shattered ecclesiastical authority, yet retained certain elite biases. He widened freedom's horizon, but did not reach its furthest boundary. Such contradictions invite dismissal from purists. Yet dismissal simplifies complexity. Human beings are layered. To expect a thinker shaped by monarchy and aristocratic culture to embody 21st century egalitarianism is anachronistic. The task is not to excuse limitation, but to understand it. Approaching 2025, we often evaluate historical figures through contemporary moral frameworks. This evaluation can clarify injustice. It can also distort context. Voltaire must be judged critically, but within recognition of his environment. His courage was radical relative to his time. His blind spots were common to it. The deeper lesson emerges here. Progress is incremental. Each generation pushes boundaries slightly further. Voltaire expanded space for critique. Later thinkers extended equality. His contradictions become evidence of evolution, not invalidation. Yet the contradictions also warn us. We too possess blind spots invisible to ourselves. We too may defend freedom selectively. We too may champion tolerance while harboring prejudice. The examination of his limits becomes mirror for our own. Psychologically, it is easier to idolize or condemn than to analyze. Idolatry simplifies. Condemnation purifies. Analysis complicates. Voltaire himself resisted simplification. He exposed hypocrisy wherever he saw it. To apply that standard to him is fidelity, not betrayal. His skepticism toward mass democracy reveals anxiety about collective irrationality. Today, democratic societies confront misinformation, polarization, populist manipulation. His fear appears less archaic than some assume. Yet distrust of the people risks paternalism. The balance remains delicate. Education becomes bridge between liberty and competence. He believed in reason as liberating force. But reason alone does not eliminate bias. Cultural assumptions infiltrate rational frameworks. Enlightenment did not instantly dissolve prejudice. It initiated process. That process continues. In examining his limitations, we must avoid two extremes. One extreme sanctifies him beyond critique. The other reduces him to his flaws. Both distort. The honest stance acknowledges brilliance and boundary simultaneously. His occasional elitism reminds us that freedom can be defended intellectually while restricted socially. He valued intellect intensely. He equated ignorance with danger. Yet, equating ignorance with incapacity can justify exclusion. Modern democratic theory insists that education should empower all, not restrict participation. The existential undertone sharpens here. To confront one's own inconsistency is painful. It threatens coherence. Voltaire demanded society confront hypocrisy. But did he fully confront his own? Likely not always. Few do. Self-examination is relentless labor. Approaching 2025, we inherit both his courage and his contradiction. We defend free speech while debating its limits. We proclaim equality while navigating structural disparities. We critique power while exercising micro-tyrannies in daily life. His imperfections resonate because they mirror ours. Another limitation surfaces in his conditional optimism about progress. He believed reason would gradually erode superstition. Yet history demonstrates resurgence of irrationality even within educated societies. Enlightenment is not linear. It faces backlash. His faith in rational advance, though cautious, underestimated persistence of tribal instinct. This does not nullify his insight. It refines it. Reason requires cultivation. It does not propagate automatically. Cultural conditions influence its survival. Education systems, media environments, political structures all shape intellectual climate. His relationship to religion illustrates complexity. He defended freedom of conscience, yet often mocked religious belief sharply. While satire served as weapon against oppression, it sometimes alienated potential allies. The line between critique of institution and dismissal of personal faith can blur. Yet perhaps sharpness was necessary. Gentle reform rarely destabilizes entrenched power. His tone shocked because complacency was entrenched. The intensity of his language corresponded to intensity of injustice. Examining limitations also clarifies his humanity. He was not abstract embodiment of enlightenment. He was man navigating constraints, ambitions, fears. He sought patronage from rulers even while critiquing monarchy. He maneuvered politically to survive. Purity was impossible within that terrain. This complexity prevents simplistic hero worship. It grounds his philosophy in lived reality. Ideas do not emerge from vacuum. They are forged within compromise and contradiction. 4. The critical question persists. How do we preserve his commitment to reason without replicating his blind spots? How do we expand tolerance without excusing intolerance? How do we defend liberty while ensuring inclusion? Voltaire's legacy demands continuation, not preservation in amber. To honor him is to surpass him where he fell short, to extend freedom more universally, to apply skepticism inward as well as outward. His life demonstrates that no intellectual revolution completes itself. It initiates trajectory. Others extend it. Enlightenment is an unfinished project. It invites correction, expansion, refinement. As we near 2025, societies confront new fanaticisms, new hierarchies, new exclusions. His critique of dogma remains vital, but so does critique of Enlightenment's own arrogance. Reason must interrogate itself. Freedom must widen continually. In recognizing his contradictions, we do not diminish his stature. We contextualize it. We learn that progress emerges through imperfect agents, that clarity and blindness coexist, that courage does not eliminate limitation. And having confronted both the force and the fracture of his legacy, we are compelled to ask how his spirit operates within the present moment, where power wears subtler masks and fanaticism migrates into digital terrain, where liberty is proclaimed loudly, yet eroded quietly. And now the battlefield has shifted. The altar is digital. The crowd is virtual. The execution is reputational. Yet the structure remains the same. Fanaticism does not disappear. It evolves. Voltaire fought a church intertwined with monarchy. We confront networks intertwined with algorithms. He battled pulpits that dictated belief. We face platforms that amplify outrage. The costume has changed. The impulse has not. And the question returns with brutal clarity. Can we think without fear in an age that records everything? Fanaticism today rarely announces itself as holy war. It disguises itself as moral certainty. It speaks the language of justice while refusing dialogue. It demands alignment, not understanding. It does not burn books. It buries nuance beneath waves of reaction. Voltaire would recognize this immediately. He understood that intolerance thrives wherever dissent is punished, socially or legally. Social media, approaching 2025, has created new tribunals. Public judgment is instantaneous. Nuance collapses into binary. Context dissolves under speed. The mob he feared no longer gathers in streets alone. It gathers in timelines. Collective outrage escalates without physical proximity, and reputations can be destroyed without due process. Freedom of speech remains proclaimed as sacred principle, yet speech now operates within systems designed to reward provocation. Algorithms amplify extremes. Moderate voices fade. Polarization intensifies. The architecture of digital communication incentivizes certainty over reflection. Voltaire's demand for rational discourse collides with economy of attention. This environment creates paradox. Never has expression been more accessible. Never has expression been more volatile. Everyone can speak. Few can endure contradiction. Tolerance erodes when disagreement is perceived as existential threat. Identity merges with ideology. Critique becomes assault. Power, meanwhile, adapts. It rarely presents itself as absolute monarch. It appears as policy, as moderation, as community standards. Regulation of speech emerges in name of safety. Safety is necessary. Harm is real. Yet who defines harm? Who decides threshold between protection and suppression? Voltaire would press relentlessly on these questions. He would not deny need to limit direct incitement to violence, but he would warn against expanding definition of offense into justification for censorship. Freedom contracts gradually. It rarely collapses overnight. Each concession appears reasonable. Cumulatively, they reshape boundaries. Religious. Fanaticism persists as well, though in altered forms. Some cling to literalism with renewed intensity. Others reject religion, yet construct secular orthodoxies equally rigid. The mechanism of exclusion remains identical. Define purity, identify heretic, enforce conformity. In this landscape, Voltaire's spirit functions as silent alarm. Skepticism must apply universally. No ideology deserves immunity. No institution escapes scrutiny. This includes secular institutions claiming moral superiority. The Enlightenment can become dogma if it refuses self-critique. The existential pressure intensifies. Individuals navigating digital public spheres experience constant exposure. Every statement archived, every misstep amplified. Fear of misinterpretation encourages self-censorship. Silence masquerades as prudence. But prolonged silence erodes freedom internally. Voltaire insisted that fear is tyrant's greatest ally. Today, fear operates socially rather than legally in many contexts. Fear of cancellation, fear of ostracism, fear of reputational damage. These pressures shape speech as effectively as formal censorship. Yet the solution is not reckless provocation. It is disciplined courage. Speak with reason. Defend others' right to speak. Engage disagreement without dehumanization. This posture demands resilience. Emotional regulation becomes civic virtue. Approaching 2025, technological acceleration magnifies ethical stakes. Artificial intelligence generates narratives. Deep fakes blur truth. Information overload fragments attention. In such environment, commitment to evidence and rational evaluation becomes more urgent. Voltaire's insistence on clarity confronts chaos, but clarity requires effort. It demands slowing down. It demands verification. It resists immediate reaction. Digital culture rewards immediacy. Thus, enlightenment faces structural opposition. The medium itself challenges patience. Power also centralizes through data. Surveillance. Capabilities expand. States and corporations accumulate information unprecedented in scope. Transparency of citizens increases, while opacity of institutions often persists. Voltaire's critique of unchecked authority extends here. If power observes without being observed, imbalance grows. Freedom in modern contexts requires new literacy, understanding algorithms, recognizing manipulation, distinguishing disagreement from threat. Education must evolve. Without it, masses become susceptible to digital demagogues. The crowd he feared takes new form. Yet despair is premature. Technology also enables dissemination of critical thought. It connects dissidents. It exposes corruption. It amplifies marginalized voices. Tools are neutral. Intention directs them. Enlightenment can adapt if anchored in principles rather than nostalgia. The psychological dimension remains decisive. Humans crave belonging. Digital communities satisfy this need instantly. Ideological tribes offer identity. Departure from tribe risks isolation. Voltaire's call to intellectual independence therefore intensifies in cost. To dissent online invites swift retaliation. But authenticity requires risk. Freedom is not comfort. It is confrontation. Each individual must choose between approval and integrity. This choice repeats daily in micro-decisions. Share or remain silent. Agree or question. Amplify outrage or seek nuance. Modern fanaticism often justifies itself through moral urgency. Injustice is real. Anger is understandable. But when anger overrides reason, it replicates the structure it condemns. Voltaire's satire targeted hypocrisy precisely because moral fervor can conceal domination. Approaching 2025, global crises intensify emotional temperature. Climate anxiety, economic disparity, political polarization. Under stress, tolerance weakens. Certainty feels stabilizing. But stability purchased through suppression undermines long-term resilience. His warning becomes sharper. When power cloaks itself in moral language, scrutiny must increase. When speech is restricted for collective good, justification must be rigorous. When dissent is labeled harmful, evidence must be clear. Freedom does not mean absence of responsibility. It means responsibility chosen rather than imposed. Ethical speech requires awareness of impact, but ethical speech cannot be enforced through intimidation without eroding autonomy. The internal battle persists. We oscillate between desire for clarity and fear of chaos. We seek authorities to simplify complexity, yet every surrender of thought contracts our agency. Voltaire's legacy insists that thinking is non-negotiable duty. In digital era, thinking requires filtering noise. It requires resisting outrage cycles. It requires patience in analysis. These habits are countercultural, but without them, enlightenment fragments. The next horizon of challenge lies beyond digital speech. It touches governance, artificial intelligence ethics, global cooperation, and emerging forms of power unimaginable in his century. The principles remain constant. Question authority, defend dignity, tolerate difference, confront suffering, examine history, acknowledge limitation. But the terrain expands, the struggle intensifies, and beneath the surface of technological modernity, the same ancient tension between fear and freedom continues to pulse, waiting for individuals willing to confront it without illusion. Voltaire does not leave us a closed system. He leaves us a blade. He does not hand down a cathedral of concepts like Kant, nor a labyrinth of inward despair like Kierkegaard. He offers something more dangerous, a stance, a refusal, a relentless demand that the human mind never kneel without questioning why. He stood in an age where church sanctified fear, monarchy sanctified hierarchy, and tradition sanctified silence. He answered with reason sharpened into resistance. He attacked fanaticism not because he despised faith, but because he despised cruelty disguised as faith. He challenged power not because he adored chaos, but because he valued dignity. He dismantled naive optimism not to breed despair, but to force responsibility. He did not promise paradise, he promised vigilance. Through skepticism, he revealed that doubt is not decay, but moral hygiene. Through deism, he separated transcendence from tyranny. Through his critique of Christianity, he defended conscience against coercion. Through his political paradox, he exposed the fragile balance between liberty and order. Through tolerance, he constructed the only architecture capable of holding pluralism without violence. Through his confrontation with evil, he stripped away metaphysical anesthesia and forced us to act rather than explain. Through his view of history, he insisted that progress is conditional, reversible, earned. Through his legacy, he proved that ideas can fracture empires. Through his limitations, he reminded us that enlightenment itself must be examined. And now, as societies approach 2025, his warning reverberates with new intensity. Power still cloaks itself in moral language. Fanaticism still feeds on certainty. Freedom of speech is still threatened not only by states, but by crowds intoxicated with righteousness. Technology has amplified voices, but not necessarily wisdom. We have more information than ever, yet courage remains scarce. The central question he asked refuses to die. Can a human being think without fear? Not think comfortably, not think safely, think freely. Freedom is not granted by constitution alone. It lives or dies in the individual conscience. Each time we choose silence to preserve approval, freedom contracts. Each time we surrender judgment to authority, whether religious, political, or digital, freedom erodes. Each time we weaponize certainty against difference, we resurrect the very structures he fought. Voltaire's greatest legacy is not a doctrine, but an ethical posture. Stand upright before power. Refuse sacred intimidation. Defend the right of others to disagree with you. Accept that progress is fragile. Admit that you too are limited. Question even the idols of enlightenment. Reason for him was never cold abstraction. It was allegiance. Allegiance to humanity over hierarchy, to dignity over dogma, to compassion over cruelty. He did not ask us to destroy faith. He asked us to prevent faith from destroying people. He did not ask us to abolish authority. He asked us to force authority to justify itself. He did not ask us to eliminate suffering with metaphysical comfort. He asked us to reduce suffering with practical courage. And perhaps that is the final severity of his message. There is no final system to hide inside, no perfect theory to end the struggle, only the ongoing demand to think, to question, to defend, to restrain, to act. Reason must stand with humanity, always. And in the moment we dare to think without fear, in the moment we refuse both fanatic certainty and cowardly silence, we discover that enlightenment is not a century behind us. It is a decision in front of us.